me. Please be seated. If you'd like to follow along with me this morning, you could turn to Numbers chapter 16, where the scripture reading was this morning. We'll be spending a lot of time in Numbers chapter 16 and 17. And if you have a copy of the bulletin, there's a place on page 3 to take some notes. But I don't know that we're going to need all of those notes today. I was looking this morning over what I've prepared to say, and I think I might have to break this into two parts. I think there's a lot that I want to say about this first instance here in Numbers 16 and 17, and we might just call it a day right there when we get to that part. But before I dive into Numbers 16, I want to ask you, how many church buildings did you pass on your way here this morning? Think about it. Just go back over the road you drove by. How many church buildings did you pass by? If you pass by more than two, I think that makes you kind of unusual in our society. A lot of folks don't understand why you would drive past a perfectly good church building to go to another church building. I remember Ross Perot. I refer to him often as he ran for president a few years ago. He, in his East Texas or West Texas drawl, would say, "Worship at the church of your choice." And it was like a kind of an idea, one of them's good as another. And, well, except that little stone one that you drive by down by the horse park there. You don't want to stop that. That's been vacant for a few years. But if they're holding services in a church building, why would you drive past? I guess that's my second question. Why would you pass so many church buildings on your way here this morning? And if somebody asks you, why did you drive past all those others to get to this one, what would you say? Well, I think the reason that you're here, I would hope that one of the reasons that you're here, part of the reason that you're here, has to do with authority and the way we look at the scriptures and the way we hold those in as our standard. It's an issue that is central to our faith and to our practice. And I want to talk about the idea of authority. I want to talk about authority with respect to framing our worship and our work. If you've come this morning because you want to praise God and you want to be closer to your brethren and edify your brethren, well, God bless you. Really, God bless you for that. That's a wonderful attitude to have. But then, what do we do now that we're here? And how do we decide what to do to praise God? I can think of 5 specific approaches, and here's the first thing you can put on the notes if you're keeping notes on the bulletin. What are these 5 different possible approaches to finding out what to do to please God? Well, how about first, anything we deem appropriate? If I think it's a good idea, then let's do it. How about a second idea? Whatever the clergy approve. Let those folks that have been to seminary determine it for us, and they can tell us what it is we ought to be doing, and we'll trust them to lead us in that area. What about the third one? We'll deal with tradition. If it's good enough for mom and dad, good enough for grandma and grandpa, it's good enough for me, and I'll just do what we've been doing as a family for years and years and years. How about that one as the third approach? The fourth approach, how about doing anything that's not expressly forbidden? If the Bible doesn't say we can't, well, let's assume that we can. That might be a good way to approach the idea of authority. And then for the fifth one, why don't we just do only what God has authorized in His Word? Let's consider those. And I wanted to consider those with 3 different scenarios that are from the Scriptures, 3 different times that God's authority was challenged and how that played out in the Scripture. This artist's rendering of the possible challenge from Korah to Moses, Korah on the left you might have guessed, and Moses on the right. No idea if that's what they looked like or not, but I thought it was an interesting picture. God's authority challenged and God's authority established. So the first one of the 3 challenges I want to consider with you, 2 from the Old Testament, 1 from the New. Korah's challenge to Moses, that's number 16, where we're about to go. David's desire to build a house for the Lord, that's in 2 Samuel 7. And then Christians debating the need for circumcision, that's in the book of Acts chapter 15. And so eventually I want to work through all three of those with you, but I think we might just this morning. Now I've said it twice, so I guess we're only going to deal with because now if I go do them all, you'll think I kept you late for school. Or what was it they used to say down in Coleman, Alabama? They used to say, you know, you can't go too long because we've got to beat the Baptist to the steakhouse. So if you're motivated by your stomach, that's a way to look at it. But all right, we're going to talk about Korah this morning. And we'll deal with that one first. Korah challenged Moses. It's a long challenge, and I'm going to work through it and just give you a commentary as we go through. But it's really a three-part contest or a three-part challenge here, starting in Numbers chapter 16. I started the reading this morning in verse 2 to spare Scott having to do all of these names. Because I think they're difficult, but in chapter 16, verse 1, now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with a number of people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. So this is the leadership of the congregation that has risen up against Moses. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, you have gone too far. For all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Do you see what they're saying? They're saying, Moses, you're our leader. But you've lifted yourself up to be our leader, and you got no right. You've gone too far. Because, what are you saying? That you're the only holy one and nobody else in the congregation is holy? Is that what you're saying? He's saying, no, everybody's holy, and you've done this on your own. Now, evidently, they weren't familiar with all that had happened when Moses was called by God, and the 5 different excuses he gave to get out of it. As a matter of fact, going and leading the children of Israel was about the last thing Moses ever wanted to do. And the last of the 5 excuses is, would you please just go find somebody else? And of course, God became angry with that. So they're not familiar with the true circumstances of how Moses became the leader. And as a matter of fact, what you're going to see is that Korah was guilty of what he accused Moses of doing. And dear ones, this is an important point because this happens a lot. This happens a lot in the world. The person who's making the accusation is actually guilty of what they've accused somebody else of. That was exactly what was going on here with Korah. Well, of course, this is not right. In verse 4, when Moses heard it, he fell on his face. He fell on his face and he said to Korah and all his company, in the morning, the Lord will show you who is his and who is holy and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. And then he says, do this. Take censers. Now, a censer is important in this story. And what you've got to understand is that a censer is like a little metal plate. And it was a metal plate that was used to hold incense. And so, you just can't hold smoldering stuff in your hand. You've got to have something that'll hold it. You've got this little plate, and you're going to put your offering on here, and you're going to bring it before the Lord. And we're all going to do that. And we're going to see who the Lord accepts. In verse 7, put fire in them, put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow, and the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. And Moses was calling it straight there. They had accused him of going too far. He accuses them of going too far. Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near to him and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you. And would you seek the priesthood also? Therefore it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? When the Lord years later would speak to Samuel, as the people had rejected Samuel from being the last judge, and they said they didn't want judges anymore, and Samuel, this is going to be the end of it. God said to him, they haven't rejected you, Samuel, you only. They've rejected me when they did this. And he says the same thing here. Moses said the same thing. When you're rejecting me as God's leader, you're actually rejecting God. And that's what you've done. It is against the Lord that you've assembled today. So, let's continue with the narrative in verse 12. Moses called to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and he said, we will not come up. We don't recognize your authority. We're not even going to come out to be presented before you. And this is their response to Moses. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey? Is he talking about the promised land? No, he's talking about Egypt there. You brought us out of a land of milk and honey. Oh, there's a little detail about that. You were slaves back there. Did you remember that? No, they didn't remember that. Just remember that they came out of a land of milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, that you must also make for yourself a prince over us. Moreover, you've not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us an inheritance of fields or vineyards. Yeah, but do you remember why that is? That's because of what the spies did. They're blaming Moses for all of these things, and they're just painting it with a rosy colors, a rosy hue. They're not getting the facts straight. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, do not respect their offering. I've not taken one donkey from them. I've not harmed one of them. And that's the truth. Verse 16, Moses said to Korah, be present, you and all your company, before the Lord, you and they, and Aaron, tomorrow. And let every one of you take his censer and put incense on it, and every one of you bring before the Lord his censer. 250 censers, you also and Aaron, each his censer. So every man took his censer, put fire in them, laid incense on them, and stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. So what a meeting that was that day. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and you will be angry with all the congregation? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So it's talking here about evil. These men are doing something evil, and the Lord's fixing to, if you will, answer back to them and treat them with what they deserve. But dear ones, if you're close to what these evil people at this time, terrible things are going to happen to you too, even if you were innocent. It says, spread yourselves away. Get away from these men. You do not want what's going to happen to them to happen to you. I think there's an idea of being in fellowship with error that speaks to us through this account. So in verse 25, Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, to the elders of Israel, followed him. He spoke to the congregation, saying, depart, please, from the tents of these wicked men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with all their sins. So they got away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents together with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. And Moses said, hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they're visited by the fate of all mankind, they die in some normal way. then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground underneath them split apart. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. What a thing to see that day. The earth opened up and swallowed all the disobedient. Well, these men it swallowed. In verse 34, all Israel who were around them fled at their cry. They said, "Lest the earth swallow us up." And they ran away. But in verse 35, fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense. So we've got two different disasters here, miraculous disasters by the Lord. The earth opening up and swallowing one group, and then we're flash frying the other group with fire from the Lord. In verse 36, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell Eleazar the son of Aaron the priest to take up the censers out of the blaze." So when everybody was burned up, these metal trays were left. And he said, now those we're going to take and we're going to do something with those. So go gather all of those up. But the fire that they brought that was not legal and not right, in verse 37, the latter part, scattered the fire far and wide. For the censers are holy, but the fire is not. In verse 38, as for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their lives, let them be made into hammered plates as a covering for the altar. For they offered them before the Lord, and they became holy. Thus they shall be a sign to the people of Israel. They had the altar upon which they offered their sacrifices regularly, and all these 250 censers were now going to be beaten together to make a kind of a covering for the altar. And every time from now on, when you approach the altar, if you knew the history, if you remembered this, you remember what happens to someone who denies the Lord's authority, specifically in the case of the leadership. So, Eleazar in verse 39, the priest took the bronze censers which were burned, had offered, which those who were burned had offered. They were hammered out as a covering for the altar to be a reminder to the people of Israel, so that no outsider who is not of the descendants of Aaron should draw near to burn incense before the Lord, lest he become like Korah and his company, as the Lord said to him through Moses. So that's really the first the first two parts of the contest. Now there's another one, beginning in verse 41. On the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Like Moses had the power to open up the earth and close it and then bring fire. They thought Moses had done that. God had done that, but they blamed Moses for it. In verse 42, when the congregation had assembled against Moses and against Aaron, they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from the midst of this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces, and Moses and Aaron said to Aaron, "Take your censer, put fire on it from off the altar, lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun." So Aaron took it as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly, and behold, the plague had already begun among the people. So what we've got here, dear ones, is like you can kind of picture the people of Israel that had complained against Moses this day. See them falling like dominoes. Just see them being taken by the plague and falling down dead, row after row, and this is happening. And what Aaron's doing is racing the plague. He goes to get his censer, put the fire on it, put the incense on it, and head out, trying to catch up with the people as they were falling row after row. And he finally does do that. In verse 47, Aaron took it as Moses said, ran into the midst of the assembly, and behold, the plague had already begun among the people. He put on the incense, made atonement for the people. He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died the previous day in the affair of Korah. And Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the plague was stopped. Oh, to be there that day and to see that, to be on the right side of the line and not see, not be part of this, but to see line after line, row after row falling, and this race. And as soon as the proper offering got out and met the plague line, everybody on the other side was fine. But turn around and you see 14,700 bodies lying there because they had grumbled against the Lord. So that brings us to chapter 17, and this matter is not over yet. This is still going on. These people are very slow to get this lesson these days. In verse 17, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and get from them staffs, one for each father's house, from all their chiefs according to their father's houses, 12 staffs. Go to the head of every tribe of Israel, and every leader's got a walking stick, right? A piece of wood that's been long dead, and you've been using that just as a prop to stand up straight. It comes in handy when you're older, to walk when you're on a trail. And get those staffs, and write each man's name on his staff, and write Aaron's name on the staff for Levi. For there shall be one staff for the head of each father's house. Then you shall deposit them in the tent of meeting before the testimony where I meet with you. And the staff of the man whom I shall choose shall sprout. Thus I will make to cease from me the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against you. Moses spoke to the people of Israel, and all their chiefs gave him staffs, one for each chief, according to their fathers' houses, 12 staffs, and the staff of Aaron was among their staffs. And Moses deposited the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the testimony. On the next day, Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and behold, the staff of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. What had happened previously, dear ones, in these exchanges is that there had been death because of the resistance to the Lord, the earth opening up and closing on a group, fire from heaven coming upon another, plague going forth in the third instance. Death had been what God was using to communicate his authority, but in this instance, what happens is life. And life comes from a dead stick, one of 12, and it comes rapidly. I mean, if in any way you could take, we do it with cuttings sometimes, take something that's alive and try to nurture that and get it to develop, but it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. But God, overnight, causes a dead stick to bring forth a bud, a blossom, and even the fruit instantly. And he brings this out in a demonstration. In verse 9, Moses brought all the staffs out from before the Lord to the people of Israel. They looked, and each man took his staff. And the Lord said to Moses, put back the staff of Aaron before the testimony to be kept as a sign for the rebels, that you may make an end of their grumblings against me, lest they die. Thus did Moses, as the Lord commanded to him. And the people of Israel said to Moses, behold, we perish. We are undone. We are all undone. Everyone who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord shall die. Are we all to perish? I still didn't quite get the meaning of this lesson, but it's an amazing thing. So they challenged Moses. They said, you take too much upon yourself. He said, assemble. Again, they said he takes too much upon himself. And the earth opened up and the fire came down. Again, they said he took too much upon himself. And the plague killed. And then finally, the budding rod was brought. The buds were brought forth on Aaron's rod. Dear ones, this incident is so important that the censers were on the altar for the rest of the time the altar was used. And this budding rod of Aaron was one of 3 items that was put into the Ark of the Covenant. A pot of manna was in there, the tablets of the covenant were in there, and Aaron's rod was in there as a lasting testimony to God's authority. He has the right to set up, to make all decisions, but really in this case, it was his leadership that was being challenged, and that he had the right to choose Aaron specifically as the priest, the one who would approach him. This budding rod that budded overnight was a record unto them. It's an amazing testimony to God's authority. I did want to talk to you about the other ones, but I'm going to skip that, as I said. But I want to go back to these 5 approaches. We'll talk about the rest some other time. How do we decide what to do to please God? Anything we deem appropriate, anything, whatever the clergy approves, whatever tradition is handed down, anything not expressly forbidden, none of those work. We have to go with what God authorizes, book, chapter, and verse. And that's the thing that we do here that's different than a lot of other places. There are other places that are confused about this, and you'll find in their practices, if you check, some things that God has not authorized. I'll just tell you that. We can go through the specifics at a time of convenience to you. And I'll put it to you this way also, that God, if he wants us to do something, he tells us, or he shows us that it is done, or he implies somehow that he wants it. And if you think that there's another way that God does communicate with us, you can tell me about that other way that you think he does, with one constraint. You've got to do it without telling me, without showing me, or without implying that it's done. Communicate it to me that way that you think God communicates to us, and that'll be good. So this is the first of 3. I think probably 2 weeks from today we'll finish this lesson. We'll talk about our theme of love one another next Sunday, Lord willing. But God's authority challenged and God's authority established in this incident of Korah rebelling against Moses. I ask you, before we are done today, are you submitting to God's authority? Are you submitting to God's authority in every aspect of your life? Are you close to someone who's not submitting to God's authority? That's a dangerous place to be also. We always make a time to get right with God, and this is that time today. If you're subject to the Lord's call, won't you come while we stand and sing number 835. There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste,